The things that we're covering are the truth about carbon capture and storage and the types of carbon capture and storage that we're opposed to, because that's not all of them actually. Also, the context, the situation that led to the Labour government supporting carbon capture and storage, and the context with other campaigns such as DRAX and sustainable aviation fuel, and also the political situation right now. Then we'll go into actions and aims of the campaign, how you can get involved and be effective. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to invite Simon Aldridge to speak first. Simon
Hello.
is a former business consultant and manufacturing CEO. He's then turned his attention to being a climate systems thinker who works at the interface between science and politics. He advises the Campaign for Climate and Nature, and he is also heading up work on a national emergency briefing. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks so much everyone for coming. It's only through people power that we're going to stop this because the government's being led by lobbyists, and until they feel stronger feelings coming from the public, via constituency MPs, then this is going to carry on. I should say, first of all, that none of us are ideologically opposed to deploying carbon capture where it's necessary. And in some circumstances, it is necessary, or it might be. But very often, there are better solutions, and Ellen will talk about that. But I'm going to focus on one of the core uses that the government intends to put carbon capture to. And I'm just going to bring up a little graphic to demonstrate what this is all about. Excuse me. So one of the key things they want to do is they want to build new gas power stations um, and blue hydrogen plants. Now, blue hydrogen is just a word for how you make hydrogen from natural gas, from methane. So it's two sorts of plants that are going to use natural gas to make power or to make hydrogen, which is later to use power, make power effectively. So we've got these new power stations that are going to be built around the country. I've only put the two extra on my little graphic there, you see, but there'll be potentially many more in the plans, and Andrew will talk about that. Now, the problem is the gas coming out of the North Sea is already maxed out. It's already it's being extracted as fast as they can get it out. That's because the North Sea is near the end of its life. Here's a chart of the sort of extraction rates, and you can see that it's tailing off almost to nothing by 2050. Even if they issued new licenses, I mean, the new licenses are bad, but even if they did, and that's why we are already in the UK importing a lot of gas, originally from the Middle East, but over the last few years, since the fracking boom in the US, we've been bringing in gas in liquefied form by ship. And in total, shipped gas in the UK over the last 4 or 5 years has averaged about a quarter of our entire supply. So when you turn on your gas cooker at home or your fire boiler, a quarter of that has come from far off, far away. Now, what's the problem? What's the problem with that? If we're capturing emissions now, well, the problem is that natural gas it's really methane. I mean, it's about 90% methane or something, and a few other bits and bobs, but for all intents and purposes, it's methane. Now, methane is a really, really dangerous warming gas. Measured over 20 years, it's 83 times worse than CO2. Now, the government takes another measurement over 100 years, but there isn't really any scientific justification for that. That's an arbitrary time period that was devised when the scientists started looking at what the effect on warming might be in the 90s, and they were looking out to 2100. So they picked this 100-year time frame. But methane has a very short, sharp effect on warming. It breaks down in the atmosphere largely within about 20 years. So it's different to CO2. But within that time, it's super, super powerful. And so leaked methane is much, much worse than burning it and turning it into CO2. Now, all the way around along this huge supply chain from these big fracking operations in the US, and that's where all this imported gas is coming from because they've had a boom in fracking. You've got methane leaking out, a few percent here, a few percent there, and because of that multiplication factor, it has an extraordinarily large effect. It also leaks on the ships across the ocean, and in the liquefaction plant, loading it onto the ships, it leaks everywhere. And then there are also CO2 emissions from burning the gas to drive the ships. So overall, that new science that came out in September last year, after being peer reviewed, shows that gas imported from the US is a third worse than coal in terms of its climate impact. Now, this is new, and so when you look at Ed Miliband backing carbon capture all the way back in the last government, he didn't know this, but I don't think he's been able to move his thinking on. Now, so the problem is the UK, under our current legislation, our outdated legislation, which was created in 2008, we ignore all emissions outside of our territorial borders. So even if our activities are causing emissions abroad, we just ignore them. And so what the government says, and sorry, I should say that this study that shows imported methane, or LNG, is a third worse than coal, found that 2/3 of the warming impact happens upstream along that huge supply chain in the form of those leaks, and only 1/3 happens when the gas is burnt or processed into hydrogen at the ultimate destination. So the government says, oh, well, we're capturing 90% or whatever of the emissions. Now, there are very big question marks over that. I'll leave that to Andrew to talk about. But even if they did manage to do that, that's 90% of 1/3, and that leaves the 2/3 completely unaddressed. And so that means even if the carbon capture works, these new plants are going to have a carbon footprint around as bad as coal. Bioenergy, just briefly, is a very similar issue. So you've got your down at the bottom there, you're logging, you're chipping, you're shipping, just like gas. That's happening overseas, almost entirely. So it's happening in America and it's happening in Eastern Europe, where they're clear cutting forests. Some of them old growth forests, although there are new regulations that are saying that they can't do that. But Drax have been fined on a number of occasions, very big fines for breaking these rules. And there were all sorts of question marks over certification, which relies on self-reporting. So you've got these first 3 stages here of logging, chipping, and shipping, and then burning. Now, what the government says is, because they say because the forests regrow, we can treat the carbon, we can treat this burning trees as zero carbon. Or what they'd actually say is, because the forest once grew and captured carbon, we can treat burning them as zero. But that's patently nonsense for a number of reasons. First of all, just to emphasize that, Drax Power Station, which used to be a coal power station, and it's one of the biggest in Europe, was converted to burn wood, and they actually treat its emissions as zero, which is mind-boggling, really. So first of all, you've got a lot of emissions anyway in your logging and chipping and shipping, all driven by fossil fuels. And then actually at Drax Power Station itself, the emissions from the chimney stacks are worse than coal in terms of the amount of energy produced, and it's UK's biggest point source of carbon dioxide. So this argument that it's circular, that the carbon's recaptured, just doesn't work, because science now shows that it takes up to 50 years or more for forests to regrow and recapture that carbon. And in a world where we're facing the threat of irreversible tipping points like the burning of the Amazon or the collapse of the Atlantic ocean current, which keeps us warm, the idea that we should be throwing all this CO2 out now and then hoping that half a century or more in the future we'll recapture it, it's just nonsense. We cannot afford to take that risk. And anyway, there's no guarantee that the carbon will be reabsorbed. So just finishing off, because I'm sure I'm coming to the end of my time. so you've got this false premise that you've got that biomass is zero carbon, and then what they say is, well, we're then going to add carbon capture equipment and bury the carbon underground, and that makes it negative. Well, no, it doesn't. If the starting point isn't zero, and it's patently not zero, it's very high carbon. So the whole thing, leaving aside the fact that the CCS for biomass is completely unproven, is a load of nonsense. Finally, you can grow crops. That's another way of doing it rather than burning down trees. But one of the Climate and Nature Bill advising scientists has said that you need an area the size of Wales to grow the feedstock for Drax. So it's complete nonsense. And I will pass over to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. That was super clear, really wonderful illustration there. Now we're going to move on to Andrew Boswell, who is the cornerstone of this campaign. He's been working redoubtably on roads and trying to bring science into policy. He's also probably the only person on this call whose name Keir Starmer would recognise. Sorry, I'm being mischievous. So Andrew has worked against false climate solutions for over 20 years. He's developed a number of legal cases against gas and biomass CCS and CCS subsidies. He is a trained scientist, and the focus of his work, as I said earlier, is bringing proper scientific scrutiny into policy making and into the courts. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everybody for attending. It's good to see so many people here. So I'm going to cover the background of carbon capture in the UK, go a bit into the sort of policy and what the government want to do, and also introduce the Scrap Carbon Capture campaign and why we need it. Well, it's very clear, really, if you saw the budget today, there's 9.4 billion pounds put into 2 further carbon capture clusters in Scotland and Humberside. We may come back to those later. But overall, that 9.4 billion is quite small compared to the total planned, and it's very expensive infrastructure, as shown in our logo here. And as Simon has explained, for fossil fuels, you have LNG being shipped across the Atlantic, and then you have gas-fired power stations or blue hydrogen plants, and then very, very costly storing the carbon dioxide underground in subsea CO2 storage sites. I was expecting my slide to move. It has now. So what is the background to UK CCS? Well, there's been 3 phases, and it started off actually with Ed Miliband back in 2008, trying to decarbonise coal power stations. And at that time, they thought, we'll put CCS on, which of course would have given us another generation of coal-fired power stations going forward, right through the decades we're in now. But in fact, as we all know, we managed to get rid of coal and do substantive decarbonisation of the energy system without CCS. So I think there's a moral in there. But in 2018, they came up with the current CCUS cluster model. And that's basically based around gas anchor emitter plants, as Simon has described. And what we've seen really in the 7 years is that there's a big build-up of institutional inertia on this. The Climate Change Committee are, in my view, part of the problem. They promote it, and the Energy Department has already got 400 people working on it. So you can see the scale of the problem. Scientists called for a review last October before they pledged another 22 billion, but we were ignored at that point, and Labour adopted the Tory policy with no scrutiny. So moving on to another super infographic here from Simon. And this is based on the recent analysis I've done of the costs in the Committee on Climate Change seventh carbon budget report up to 2050. And what you see is huge amounts of money. It's an enormous amount of money. CCS is proposed across 6 different sectors in the carbon budget report. So gas, we talked about, biomass, we talked about, hydrogen, that includes blue hydrogen production, direct air capture, we won't be talking about, incineration also, not very, very good, and industrial emissions like cement. Now, the first thing is, don't believe the hype that CCS is about capturing existing emissions from industry. That is not what it's all about. You see 22 billion put in there out of this. This is over 400 billion, actually, if you add it up. And the sectors we're concerned with challenging are those ones I've ringed in red now, the gas, biomass, and hydrogen. And that is where the vast majority of the money is being spent. So what does a cluster look like? Well, this is Teesside. And initially, you'd have what in Teesside's net zero power, that is a gas-fired power station, as I said, potentially using a lot of LNG and increasing amounts of LNG in the future, and a CO2 pipeline out to the store. So that's the basic, what they call the anchor bit. And then you have other emitters. And this is what the hype put out in Teesside has put out the numerous emitters on this map. But we'll see what the cluster actually looks like. It's basically the Net Zero Teesside, a blue hydrogen plant from BP, and this one here in purple is the only one of those other ones they've actually bringing forward. It's a very small grey hydrogen plant. They're going to turn into another blue hydrogen plant. So that will make some savings, but nothing compared to the emissions from all those methane leakages in the supply chain for both the gas-fired power station and the blue hydrogen plant there in Teesside. And it's very difficult to see, I think, how actually the thing will ever be carbon neutral, because the high emitting gas and blue hydrogen plant is locked in very early on, very high carbon footprint right from the beginning. And as other emitters come on stream, they're not going to offset that. So back to our scrap carbon capture campaign, what we're saying is that we need an independent review. There's new science, Simon introduced it, that paper. There's also remote sensing data and satellite data, which shows that all the emission factors they use to estimate upstream emissions are highly underestimated. At the same time, the Committee on Climate Change ignores those emissions because they're outside UK territory. We'll come back to that. And they give basically business as usual advice. They're as locked into the fossil fuel lobbyists as the government.
Just to give you a 5-minute warning, Andrew, sorry to interrupt you.
I literally have about 30 seconds to go. Thanks, Jess, for that. So just to say that our two asks are that we have an independent review. The Committee on Climate Change advice needs to be independently reviewed as much as anything else. And that the climate plan, which has already been found twice to be unlawful, they remove gas and bioenergy CCS from that. And bear in mind, we're not opposed, as Simon said at the outset, to industrial emissions being captured. There's gas and bioenergy we're focusing the campaign on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. That was super clear. The third person that is going to talk to us is Ellen Rowbottom from the Campaign Against Climate Change. This section is also going to be fascinating because it focuses on jobs. Ellen is an expert on carbon capture, and she works for the Campaign Against Climate Change, as I said, and she also has campaigned against biomass at Drax. Over to you, Ellen.
Sorry, I've just somehow lost the slide that I was sharing. Right, I think I'm okay.
Perfect.
No. Sorry, just give me a second. Okay. Sorry about that little hold up. So this is really going to be a very, very broad brush kind of discussion of the jobs angle. But you know, we've heard already. We've really heard all about the scientific and the technical reasons why we're opposed to these carbon capture plants. But we really, as well as that, we've already also got quite a serious political problem with them. At the moment, or at least with our energy transition more generally. So I'm just going to quickly run through the key points that I think need to be made. So first of all, we are seeing mass job losses in the energy industry, huge job losses at the moment, and these are driving a backlash against climate action that's being exploited by Reform, by the right-wing media, and more generally. Driving something of a skepticism about climate action. Those job losses are not caused by climate action, but by lack of proper transition planning for workers in high emissions sectors. But nevertheless, this is one of the things that the government's responding to by throwing around these extravagant jobs promises for carbon capture projects. So we need to unpack that. We need to look at the jobs that really are needed in order to accelerate rollout of renewables. We also need to look at other aspects of the energy system that are not just about power generation. And another major factor here in terms of jobs is the huge skill shortages in a lot of the areas that we need for a low energy transition. Simon's already shown this slide talking about the existing depletion of the North Sea gas fields. So so from today, production is expected to fall by another 97% by 2050, or by 95% even if new licenses are issued. So this idea that it's banning new licenses that's causing the problem is not true. That's a myth. So already more than half of the jobs supported by the North Sea oil and gas fields have gone just in the last decade. And based on what Simon has already explained, I think it's clear that reducing fossil fuel demand, which is what we want to do, is not going to take away North Sea jobs. What it's primarily going to do is to reduce oil and gas imports, given that our North Sea production is declining so rapidly anyway. And as I've said, the real threat to jobs is the fact that we don't have a clear transition plan in place for the workforce. We know that many skills in the oil and gas sector are transferable to offshore wind, but the training requirements and the lack of clear support and redeployment pathways is still a barrier for those workers. But we can't set jobs against rapid climate action. It's not jobs or climate action. They both go together. But it's got to be real climate action and not just putting in carbon capture, which is not going to help with this at all. So we've got massive job creation projections from the industry and from the government. So the Carbon Capture and Storage Association saying that carbon capture usage and storage projects could create a peak of over 70,000 new jobs between now and 2035. I won't read the entire box because I guess you'll be able to read it for yourself. But the obvious first thing to say is that's an awful lot of jobs to stake on what we've already heard is a very shaky technology capture rates won't reach the nameplate figures, storage capacity is still unknown, and gas-based CCS projects and bioenergy with carbon capture as well are both scientifically discredited. So what do we need to do? The large majority of the jobs are short-term in the construction phase, so let's not get taken in by these massive jobs numbers, because the majority of them will go once the construction is complete, if that ever happens. As you can see, a lot of the projections include indirect and induced jobs. Well, the induced jobs are usually low-paid jobs like in retail and hospitality. They're the jobs that are created by the spending of other workers. So they go as well. When the high-skilled workers move on to other construction projects, the induced jobs go as well. Will these jobs ever materialise? Well, quite possibly not, because although we're not primarily focusing on industrial carbon capture here, it is the case that by locking industrial sites into the clusters with the gas CCS and with the blue hydrogen, it's quite possible that this will lock in the use of carbon capture into industries that really ought to be going down the electrification route, and is possibly also diverting funding from that electrification route, which is much more effective in terms of emissions reduction. But also some of those industries might walk away from the cluster schemes, so we don't know, whether they will actually materialise. And really, the projections that have been produced are, I would say that they're lobbying tools rather than objective. Thank you, thank you, Jess. So if people would be interested in what a better transition for the North Sea would look like, I would very much recommend that people, I would very much recommend that people look at the report that's on the Uplift website, which is about building a North Sea transition that actually works for people. And I've skipped on to the next one because I'm nearly out of time, but really to remind people, this is not all about power generation. When we're looking at jobs, actually, the most gas that we burn in this country is what we put in our boilers at home. So public money invested in retrofit and public transport is an absolutely vital part of the transition, and it needs to run side by side with the rapid rollout of renewables. But it's where a huge proportion of the jobs are that we need. Public money invested in retrofit and also public transport will create thousands of decent jobs in all parts of the country. And also new jobs in the supply chain for those sectors could be concentrated in these economically vulnerable areas that we're talking about. And I'm just going to very, very quickly just point people to this, because I've not spoken about biomass, but here's a sector examination of what could happen just in the case of Drax Biomass Power Station, which is potentially looking for funding to do carbon capture. This is a report that talks about the jobs that could be created as an alternative to this. And it's very, very conservative estimates, but it's really, really worth looking this up and having a read of it. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Good if I have my sound on. I'm now going to have a look at what we can do and what the people on the call can do. And I'm also going to give a brief introduction to what MP Watch does, for those of you who don't know, so that you can understand what our approaches and the resources are. But I also want to mention that one of our partners in this is the amazing Zero Hour. We're very happy to be working with them, and we feel that this coalition is a really robust one. So thank you, Zero Hour, for all the support that you're giving to us. Okay, I'm now going to do the very tricky thing of talking and trying to get my slides up. So forgive me if I get a bit glitchy. Great. So MP Watch superpower is in its grassroots constituency groups. We're a kind of community who support each other with developing a relationship with our MP. Oh. The national group also organise events and campaigns. We talked to Andrew and to Simon about this, and our local groups were very glad to say are supporting us. We've also supported Clive Lewis's private members bill to get water into public ownership. So what our way of approaching MPs is to try to develop strong relationships within a constituency between climate activists within a constituency and the MP. We know some MPs report to us that they receive over 1,000 emails a day. So sometimes with campaigns where where there's a big flurry of emails, I think MPs kind of batten down and think, oh, that campaign's kind of trying to get us, or trying to interest us, and what we're trying to do is have a kind of human-to-human relationship with as many constituents as possible who are interested in the climate and nature, and to become allies with them. And our methodology has been successful because we have managed to get people to propose amendments, to ask questions in the House, and generally do helpful things to the campaigns. Another thing which is very relevant to this campaign, we've been very lucky to have people like Simon and Andrew, a couple of Tyndall scientists at the Sustainable Aviation Fuel one, to support us by putting together briefing documents using their expertise about particular areas, either of spending or of policy, that are going through usually the House of Commons, because we're MP Watch, although we do occasionally also approach peers. So that's the end of that. Yeah, bear with me. I've now lost the document. Yes, here we go. So I'm just going to give you a bit of the political context of why we're where we are. As I think Andrew said, actually, the Climate Change Committee has recommended carbon capture and storage, and I think that was under Lord Deben. Unfortunately, the more recent chairman has expressed skepticism about the project. But unfortunately, in spite of being a great advocate for climate in some ways, Ed Miliband also believes in carbon capture and storage. And I think Andrew referenced how he started a project earlier in his career. As you will know, Rachel Reeves, like Boris, seems to love a big infrastructure project. Most of her spending is on capital projects going into the future. And it seems that when Labour got into power, the team at DESNZ, instead of looking sceptically at Claire Coutinho's figures, just took the Conservative workings out at face value. And that's one of the reasons that Andrew is saying that we need an inquiry into it. I don't think you should despair of Labour altogether. There are some great backbench MPs, including people like Clive Lewis, Nadine Whittam, Chris Hinchcliffe, Alex Sobel, who are great on climate and nature. certainly Clive Lewis has asked questions in the House, has been up for that. Sadly, right now, the Lib Dems declare themselves neutral on it, but we have had some support through asking questions in the House from Caroline Voden and Vera Hobhouse. We probably shouldn't rule out all Conservatives if you happen to have a Conservative MP as well. If they're climate deniers, then it may not be worth it. But even Claire Coutinho recently backtracked on Drax. So don't have prejudice against Conservatives. If you don't know that they are deniers, I would have a go and try to lobby them. Not unexpectedly, the Greens have been our biggest ally, and Adrian Ramsey supported a protest outside the Royal Courts and also is on our video and has asked questions in Parliament for us. Now, how do you talk to your MP about carbon capture and storage? Well, one thing that you can do is read our carbon capture and storage briefing, which is on the MP Watch website and was recently updated so that it's to include more recent events, because particularly Andrew's been working very hard on this the campaign has advanced. There's also an excellent 0 Hour letter on the 0 Hour website, which I'm sure Alan will put in the chat, where after reading the briefing, you can find a letter. You are encouraged to change it and personalize it, not only because that's a more effective way of going about it, but also because I think there have been some glitches where people have tried to just send the letter whole. I think it's more likely it will work if you change it. Also, please look at the social media of 0 Hour, of Scrap Carbon Capture and Storage. I think they're mostly on Insta. 0 Hour is often on X and Blue Sky. MP Watch is on X and Blue Sky. And I meant to ask Ellen, maybe you could unmute Ellen, how the best way to follow your campaign is.
I'll put can you hear me? I'll put
Yes.
the link to the campaign against climate change in the chat now.
Brilliant, thank you.
There is an email address that you can get to us on.
Wonderful. I don't know if anybody is timing me, but I think I'm probably at my 5 minutes. And so this is the end of the presentation section of our meeting. I now need to open the questions document. If anybody here hasn't posted a question, it's not too late. Please put it in the chat to the Zoom. I've got a question from Nick Hodgkinson. Do you want to ask your question, Nick? Do you want to unmute if you're here? That's not happening. I'll ask the question then. What is the panel's view on CCS for aviation? Aviation is expected to be the largest emitting UK sector in 2050 and will be very dependent on CCS unless airport expansions are stopped now. Who would like to answer that? Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, for that question. That's a really pertinent question to the analysis we've done on the Committee on Climate Change work, because what you have at 2050 are two sectors which still have significant emissions, and one is aviation, somewhere around 30 million tonnes a year, accountable to the UK, and agriculture is the other one, I think around 20 million. And why the CCC want to have something, in excess of 50 million tons, capturing 50 million tons of CO2 by that stage, is to balance the books. And that sounds okay until you realize that if it's BECCS, or if it's, which is bioenergy, or if it's gas, that, as Simon himself explained, most of the emissions are happening outside the UK and not being accounted properly. So you may balance the books for the UK, but you're not balancing the books in a real scientific sense and globally. So there is the sort of crux of the problem. Essentially, we need to address aviation in another way, and that is with reducing aviation, having frequent flyer levies, and all these things to reduce it. And as I think you said, Nick, actually in the chat, I just noticed, well, that would reduce the demand for CCS, and it absolutely would. I'm sure Simon's got something to say on that one as well.
Yeah, over to you, Simon.
I always have something to say, Andrew. So very, very quickly, there are three types of so-called sustainable aviation fuel. Firstly, using waste oil from all sorts of sources. Now, the problem is everyone says they're using waste oil, and it's already used for like feeding livestock, manufacturing soap, making rubber and detergents, and everyone says they're going to use it. And of course, when a big company comes along and buys up the waste oil, they push the other people who are already using it to buying primary palm oil from places like Malaysia, which is destroying rainforest and has a really high carbon footprint. The Royal Society estimated that if we used 80% of the UK's entire stock of waste oil, it would only power 0.6% of our flights. So it's utter nonsense. That's number one. Number two, synthetic aviation fuels made with renewable energy. The US Department of Energy themselves, they wouldn't do this now, but they did. They calculated that powering all their US domestic flights on e-fuel would use 85% of the total generation capacity of the US. And so, of course, any use of it just delays net zero. If you're diverting solar into making e-fuels, it means burning more gas in the power station. So terrible. And then the third one is plant-based aviation fuels. And, again, this is just, it's a threat to food security. The Royal Society said replacing all UK jet fuel with plant-based biofuels would require over 50% of our agricultural land. So it's absolute lunacy. And it's a disgrace that these politicians talk about it. It's scientifically illiterate, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Great, Simon, that you're on the fence on that one. I'm going to ask Mohammed if he would like to ask his question now. Would you like to unmute? No, I'm not having much luck at getting people to answer their question. So the question was, how about the geological considerations for injecting CO2 underground? Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. I'm pleased you've asked about that, Mohammed, and also Nikki Crosby has as well, about the integrity of storage. The same question, really. Essentially, injecting CO2 into subsea structures is extremely difficult. It's much harder than getting gas out, for example, in the first place, though the industry often sort of compares it to that. There's several sort of interesting things. One is that there's a case in Norway where, which has been going for about 20 years, where they've been putting CO2 under the sea there, and they actually found that the CO2 had moved to a completely different place from where they predicted it would. It didn't actually leak, but it rose up in the underground cavern closer to the surface and to sort of capping rock, which was less secure, less layers of capping rock. So the sort of moral of that is that, well, yeah, predicting this stuff's very difficult. Um, and there are very serious unknown risks. I mean, another thing is that the insurance world is, the insurance world is not actually insuring this now, and that's why the governments and things have to pick up the underwriting the risks of it. But what I do want to say on the cluster issue and that Teesside cluster, that we now know that there's science paper written by the industry themselves, which has said, well, we don't think we can expand this beyond the initial, I had the blue and the red dot, which were the gas-fired power station and the hydrogen plant, and that adds up to about 4 million tons a year. They're saying, well, the idea of the cluster is then you expand the CO2 source storage to take more. But they're saying, well, they may not be able to do that because they may not be able to physically expand the storage site rapidly enough to keep up with further industrial decarbonisation sites coming on. So that's another issue which I think plays against the cluster model about whether it will ever get carbon neutral, because you may not be able to bring industrial sites on, even if they're ready to connect to it.
Right. Now I'm going to move on to another question because I'm conscious we've only got 9 minutes left on the call. Gareth in Leeds, please be the first person to ask a question yourself if you're here. Are you here, Gareth? Maybe there's something going technically wrong I'm not aware of. Okay, I will ask. Thousands of scientists are telling us that we're facing potential collapse of our society. Are we letting the perfect be the enemy of the good? Shouldn't we be trying everything? Ellen, I'm going to give that to you because you haven't asked one, and then maybe Simon if he's got more to add.
Well, I think one clear answer to that is that when we're pursuing solutions that actually make the problem worse, we're not talking about the less perfect. We're talking about something that we have reason and evidence to believe makes it worse. But also, these false solutions are displacing the ones that we need. So there's an enormous opportunity cost here, because we're putting money, we're putting labour power, and we're putting time, which we don't have, into solutions that, when we know that we do have better alternatives, that then we should be getting cracking with those immediately.
Yes, I think another thing is that the fossil fuel companies know they're on the way out, and they're being very smart at putting fake solution forward that kind of keep them in the game. And if we were just going for clean green energy, the clock would be very much ticking on what they're doing. But coming up with these fake solutions gives them a little bit more time. So Mel in Dorchester, I thought Ed Miliband was one of the good guys. Why is he backing this?
I think I probably briefly alluded to this, is that he was quite instrumental in working on this back in 2008, 2009. And back then this science wasn't out about LNG. And in fact, we probably weren't, the US LNG boom hadn't even happened. So there was nothing wrong with Ed thinking this seemed like a good idea at the time. But what's happened is that he's not listening to the scientists. They've had I think someone worked out that they've met on average lobbyists from the CCS or fossil fuel sector almost every day for the last few years, but they've refused to meet scientists. And it's not just a handful of scientists objecting to this. Every single scientist I've spoken to who isn't somehow invested in this, or maybe it isn't a geologist working in fossil fuels or doesn't work with the government, every single other scientist says it's an absolutely ludicrous idea, but they haven't been able to get near Ed. And so, I mean, I think Ed is a good guy, but I think he's been misguided, and I think he's finding it unable to shift his position because he probably thinks he'll be hammered. I mean, it's a big turnaround, isn't it? But we can't keep doing this, because if we do, we are heading down a very dark path if this happens. We're accelerating we're putting our foot on the accelerator towards the precipice if this goes ahead, at the scale they're planning.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. Linda Walker, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Can you
Great.
hear me? Yeah, I'm in Derbyshire, and Peak Cluster want to have a major CCS project for cement and lime. And they try and give the impression that CCS is a completely proven technology, and there aren't really any technical problems, and they won't give any kind of estimate about how much it's all going to cost. But it's hard to know with cement. It's not such a clear issue, is it, as with the gas? I know Simon's already put some comments in about this, but I'd like to hear some more thoughts on it.
Brilliant question. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Linda. It is really important that, and our campaign, first of all, makes it quite clear that we're opposed to fossil fuel and biomass-based CCS primarily. So there may well be a case for decarbonising cement with CCS, but our approach would be that you should de-link that decarbonisation of cement from these clusters which are based around fossil fuels. For all the reasons we've given, the clusters lock in fossil fuel use for the future, and they lock in very high emissions. So any emissions you save on cement just don't, those savings just get swamped by new emissions from methane over the Atlantic and so on. So take the cement out of the current cluster model and then make a case for it. That's what we're saying. We're not saying there is necessarily a case, but we're saying that possibly is, and there may be in some cases a case. So as far as Derbyshire is concerned, I think the issue there are quite a few cement. I think there's up to about 5 all in an area on that Derby one. But what we're not quite clear about actually is where the CO2 is going to go for that. Some of it may go to HyNOT, which is based on blue hydrogen plant. And I've also seen stuff about it going up the Morecambe Bay, which seems to be outside of HyNOT. So we need more information on that side of things.
So sorry, Andrew, I'm going to cut you off because we're getting quite close to time.
Can I say one very quick thing, Jess?
Okay, really quick.
Cement, let's distinguish cement and concrete. So we're talking about concrete, which is made with cement. So, these manufacturers want to carry on making cement because that's what they make. But there are people starting to make concrete in a different way. So I've shared a link there to something called earth-friendly concrete. Now, I know this is being sold. I don't know how much premium there is, but I think, we need to be thinking outside the box and looking at redesigning things rather than patching really expensive, unreliable, unproven CCS on top.
Okay, the final question before we say goodnight is from Sophie, who says, and I'm going to give this to Andrew because he is the foundation of this campaign. Are we just going to talk about what the problem is? Are we planning some kind of action? How can I help?
Oh, okay. Yeah. And perhaps thank you, Sophie. In my presentation, it probably didn't come across clearly that there's 2 asks of this campaign. One is for the independent scientific review, and the other is for CCS, if it's based on fossil fuels or biomass, to be taken out of the climate plan. So the action, as far as this campaign going forward, is to try to reach your MP either with the email action. Someone sent me a letter, copied me a letter today, actually saying I've written a much better letter, and I thought it was. So it was about a third of the length of ours. So do write your own letter, but if possible, ask your MP to meet with them. And that's what we really wanted to talk about tonight, actually. And I would say, although we're up to our 8 o'clock, if people want to stay on to talk a bit more about how to talk to MPs, then I think some of us would stay here to have that discussion. And I'd encourage you to sort of contact your MP as soon as possible, and also to say that we'll come along and help if it's a sort of Zoom meeting or something. Though I know they don't necessarily want to talk to non-constituents and things. That can be a problem. But anyway, it's about opening doors, I think, into parliamentarians.
There is also, if you want to do it in good company, there is the mass lobby on the 9th of July. And all of us on this call supporting the campaign will be happy to help you. If you don't belong to an organisation that's already going to the lobby, you'd be very welcome to come as a kind of new friend to MP Watch. We're part of the Climate Coalition, and we can help you navigate how to get into the Climate Coalition system, work out what time to meet your MP, and come on the day. We'd be very glad of your doing that. But if you can't make that and you want to see your MP in your constituency, we'd also be very glad. I'll be glad to talk to you about the approach to take. Somebody put in the chat, what if you just get standard kind of fob offs? We've got some techniques for that as well. So basically, please contact any of us on the call. If you had technical issues, Andrew, Ellen, and Simon will be excellent at guiding you on how to ask those questions. But do also look at the MP Watch climate briefings, which has a CCS briefing in it, written by Simon and Andrew, that go through what the main issues are and are designed for an MP to be able to see in very quick time. Now, I can't stay that long, and I know that Alan was expecting to finish at 8 o'clock. Alan, do you want to come out of your purdah and just let us know, maybe by voice or in the chat, how long we've got?
Yeah, so I think if people do want to drop off, they can. I'm more than happy to stay online and keep the conversation going. So if people do have a yeah, but obviously we understand if people had other plans, feel free to drop out. This will be recorded, and we'll record right the way to the quarter past. So. And I will just say, I know I'm not on camera, but I will just say we have captured everyone's question. So if you've registered and we have your name, we will follow up with the question if we haven't answered it so far. So even if you've asked a question and we haven't got around to it, you will get an email from us telling us probably very technical answers, but hopefully it'll help.
Yes. Okay. So does anybody have a question? Maybe just put it in the Zoom chat about MPs. Yeah. Dennis usually meets his in the pub. Take along our briefing, Dennis. That's great. Okay, bye, Charlotte. Thank you, Mary and Scott. Any further questions? Just put your hand up, and because now I'm freestyling by looking in the chat, and that's not quite so good. Felicity.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yep, great. Yes, I just had put a question in the chat. It's about, we've got a local planning application, which is tomorrow. So I was thinking it'd be good to put my hand up now rather than wait for a response. And it's for an energy from waste application, and they're putting in there that they will be carbon capture retrofit ready. And I was just wondering if there's any material planning considerations that can be used in this situation.
Andrew.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I actually stopped an incinerator. I mean, not individually, but with a large campaign like this in Norfolk, sort of 12 years ago. I mean, on the incinerators in general, in my view, are a really bad thing. and you know, the energy they produce is very, very high carbon intensity energy. But you know, the main arguments against incinerator in the first place is things like air pollution and PM 2.5s and, you know, particulate matter. That on terms of the CCS ready aspect, well, I'd be looking at, I guess, when is the CCS actually going to be added? Because they might be trying to get us that there's regulations that, well, the Committee on Climate Change have said that all sort of new incinerators should have CCS, but I don't think there are regulations actually. But there's a sort of onus on them to put CCS on. But just being ready doesn't actually mean that they will put the CCS on for years and years, you know. So I would be looking at that because it's very high carbon energy coming from an incinerator without CCS. I don't know if that helps at all, but if the meeting's tomorrow, you haven't got much time, but presumably there's more time after that, is there?
Yes, it will probably be ongoing.
Yeah. Well, keep in
Yeah, no,
touch.
that's fine. It was regarding the CCS specifically. All of the other
Right.
factors I've sort of
Oh, okay.
researched well.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And do remember you can get back to Andrew afterwards if you want some clarifications on the
Yeah,
answers
absolutely.
you were given.
Thank you.
Ellen, is your hand up to contribute to that or about a separate matter?
Well, it was about another question that's in the chat actually, but I can hold on to that.
Okay, let's since we have some people who want to in person ask, let's see. Steve, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, regarding kind of carbon capture storage, am I right in thinking that they, you know, in order to stop releasing the carbon into the atmosphere, which contradicts, you know, we're again bringing down the climate temperatures, they're going to have to store it for about 200 years? Am I right in thinking that?
Well, shall I go? I mean, I think they're talking about permanent storage, and I really hope so. The amount of CO2 they're talking about storing. If you look at the IPCC reports, they're talking about absolutely massive amounts of storage from BECCS. So, you know, we don't want that to go ahead. But if it did go ahead, you've got gigatons and gigatons down there stored. And if that sort of went out after a few, even a few hundred years, it would be catastrophe for future generations. I mean, this is you know, one part of the problem, that we don't know how secure these storage sites are going to be.
This is what I'm trying to understand, you know, with the incinerator business. You know, it's the incinerator that's locally to us is 260,000 tons a year. So that's 260,000 tons of carbon a year. And there's no room on where they're going to put it, where they're going to store it. I don't understand how this, you know, it's a myth.
Where is that incinerator?
It's Canford in Dorset.
Oh, okay. I didn't know about that one. But
there's three going on. There's Canford, Portland, and Parley, but Canford one's tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, they have that one's not near a cluster at the moment, so they might be talking about putting the CO2 onto HGVs or trains and that sort of thing. There are those sort of proposals made when they're not near a cluster.
They're actually thinking about just building a plot of land. They're saying, oh, it's carbon capture ready. Here's a plot of land. We'll put it there when it's invented. That's their argument to put forward this proposal.
Well, I think that's where they put the CCS capture bit, is it? It's not. The storage will be somewhere else, I think.
Okay. So they don't.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are sort of, as I said, there's odd ideas, you know, about transporting it by rail and road and things like this, or long pipelines. But I mean, you know, even so, they're not necessarily going to catch 90% of carbon emissions from an incinerator. So you still have CO2 being emitted.
Can you repeat that again? Sorry, they're not going to capture
all the CO2.
Okay.
They claim 90%, but the industry is struggling in most places to capture 70%. So you've still got, even from an incinerator, it's got to have 30% going
And
up.
I think Simon put in one of his
Thank you.
posts, why would you trust them? Our water companies are putting sewage in rivers and seas flagrantly. This is an invisible gas. How can we possibly, unless we've got citizens, scientists there monitoring them all the time, how the hell will we know what's going on?
Yeah.
I've got a question here before I go to Shane, which I am very much going to try to, but it's from Brian Jones. Why is it so hard to convince MPs that tidal would be cheaper and more reliable than any fossil fuel-based energy system? Is that one for Simon or Ellen, maybe? Who? Simon?
Sorry. So tidal's very expensive and it lasts, it's a very long scale project. Private companies don't really want to put up the money for those sorts of projects. They have to be funded by the state. And the government doesn't want to talk about the climate crisis, and it wants to keep everything within business as usual. It doesn't want to spend too much money on it. And that's why we're in this problem, because they're turning to the private sector to sort of bail them out. And what does the private sector want to invest in? They want to invest in scarce oil and gas, where you can charge sky high prices and make monopoly profits, basically. And that's exactly why we're seeing this. That's what they want to put their money in. If we were to take a practical approach here, a proper emergency approach, and the government would tell the population about the crisis we face, something like the lead up to World War II, the state would spend a lot of money on these things. Now, we know, Andrew and I have been going through the Climate Change Committee's reports in detail, and buried deep in their latest report is this clause that says we have limited proposed government spending on net zero to no more than 2% of total managed public expenditure. That managed means discretionary, so it excludes social security. So it's about like 1% of total public spending. That's what they've limited it to. And then we're asking the private sector to come in with their, pardon my French, bullshit solutions. I went back and looked at what this country spent in the 1930s on defense in the lead up to the Second World War. And it never dropped below 8%. And then it rose up to 24% in the full clear year before the war broke out. That's the difference. If we were serious about this, we'd invest. And there's a really strong payback as well in all these things like insulation and renewables.
So finally, Shane, would you like to ask your question? And this will be the last one of the evening.
Okay, yes, thank you, all four of you. That was fascinating, and I particularly hadn't realised the sort of 2/3 leakage in the supply chain for gas. And yeah, MP briefing, I'm going to be looking at that. My question really is do the panel think this is just another example of medieval indulgences? But as I'm sure we all know, medieval indulgences, you did something wrong, the vicar would tell you to walk backwards around the church 6 times and pay him a few bob, and your sins would be absolved. And we've had carbon offsetting, carbon credits, net zero, and now it seems to be CCS, and it just seems like another fig leaf from the oil industry, and they're often mouthpieces in the lobbying industry and government are winning again, and we're just being presented with today's solution, which will be tomorrow's problem. And yeah, I mean, it just seems
I
like
don't think we need to answer that. We all agree, don't we?
Yeah. And this isn't just happening here. This same battle is happening all over the world. This isn't coming from the government. It's coming from the fossil fuel industry, and that's what we need to recognize.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with you totally.
Okay. Brilliant. Well, thank you, panelists. Thank you for giving great presentations to time. And thank you, Alan, for keeping us all safe behind the scenes. We're going to have to stop now, but Please, there'll be another webinar next month, and we'd love to see you all again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Maybe we can do a positive one next time on how 100% renewables is feasible, and we'll save us all lots of money. And the faster we go, the more we save.
Yes. And Andrew, look forward to seeing you at Speakers Forum in Glasgow.
Yeah, looking forward to that, Jay.
And if anybody else is coming along, Andrew will be speaking.
Wonderful. Yes,
Bye,
please
very
say
Thank you
goodbye.
very much.
Please feel free to say goodbye. Yes.
Thank you.
Bye, night.